We just want to remind you it is 20 minutes to 8 Eastern Time, and the polls are still open in 41 states around the country and also in the District of Columbia. And as we have said once earlier this evening, there are important local propositions as well as local races. If, for example, you live in the District of Columbia where the polls are still open, you can vote on whether or not you want to provide money to shelter the homeless. If you live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the polls are still open, you can vote on whether or not you want nuclear research conducted within the city limits. So that's important reason for people to vote in areas where the polls have not closed if you have not done so. David?
Peter, there's another one. In Montana, you can vote on a proposition that makes it legal for non-dentists to sell false teeth. At the moment, it is illegal. Bert Lance, I don't know how happy he is. I'm about to ask him. Bert, how are you?
Fine. How are you tonight?
He's standing by in Atlanta. You can't possibly like the results you have seen so far. Mr.
No.
Reagan, we have called, projected as the winner in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Those are all your states.
President Reagan ran a fine campaign. His people did an awfully good job, and it turned out that the big problem with the Democratic Party was that we were moving in a direction different than the voter was moving, and I think that's very evident in the South tonight.
What do you mean by that, different direction from the voters?
Well, I think that we have seen in the South, we've seen the fact that the South is now at the mainstream of the political process of the country, that people in the South pretty well express the views and concerns of the people throughout the nation, and the Democratic Party for some time now, because of the cumulative weight of interest groups and things of that type, have caused it to move in a direction away from the voter instead of with the voter, and I think you're seeing that tonight.
Mr. Lance, let me ask you one more question about the talk we keep hearing here about the two parties in the southern states coming to be polarized, the Democrats having the black voters and the Republicans the white voters. What do you think of that?
I don't think that's going to happen, David. I think that we're going to see, as time comes and goes now, the fact that there is a common interest in regard to economic circumstances in our nation, that black and white voters are going to be able to be in the same party and be effective toward
electric. Then came typing that looked like printing.
It's not going to be an easy set of circumstances for the next couple of years, but we Democrats are alive. We're going to keep on trying to make sure that we bring the sort of concern to the needs of people that we have in the past, and I think that's going to be an integral part of what we're all about.
Mr. Lance, I want to ask you about Georgia in a moment, but you talked a moment ago as if this was a new revelation about the Democratic Party not realizing where people in the South were going. Didn't nobody figure this out at the beginning of the campaign?
Well, I think we talked about it early on, and I think that was one of the reasons that I felt like, as well as did the other Southern Party leaders, that it was imperative to have a Southerner on the ticket in order to make sure that we got local officials, local Democratic officials, to support the ticket. This is one of the things that we talked constantly about early on in the campaign and said how important it was. And I think now we're seeing the fact that it was a rather important effort that wasn't made by the National Party, and I think that this is some difficulty with regard to which we have been faced.
You're a very polite man, I know, but has Geraldine Ferraro been a real liability in the South?
Well, Geraldine Ferraro, not because she's a woman, but because of the liberal perception. I get a little bit of credit for having said that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I've got another little saying for you and David tonight that says that pioneers get all the arrows. And I think that we have seen, with regard to running on a program of increased taxes, of having a liberal perception about the running mate for Vice President Mondale, I think that that's created some real problems in the South, and I think that that's a part of what we're facing up to. We're going to have to change our direction in the future.
You're saying the Democratic Party is too liberal for the South now?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply saying that I think the Democratic Party has to move in the same direction that the voters moving in. And voters change and parties change, and I think that that's what we've got to make sure happens in the future, that the Democratic Party, the national party, begins to pay attention to what the people in the South are saying, that the leadership pays attention to the direction that the voters moving in, and that the two start meeting somewhere instead of going in opposite directions, and I think that's what's been happening in the past.
Were you surprised, by the way, to see Walter Huddleston defeated in Kentucky, Democrat?
Yes, I'm surprised about that. I think he's an extremely fine senator, and I'm very surprised about that.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Lance, for coming in to join us. Bert Lance.
Good to be with you.
Sir, the Kentucky Senate race we called a few minutes ago, and if you happen not to be with us, it was more than a surprise, it was astonishing. The incumbent Democrat, D. Huddleston, by our projection, has been defeated by Mitch McConnell, the Republican. That's a clear gain of 1 seat in the Senate for the Republicans.
Mitch McConnell, by the way, is 42 years old, David. He's a is a county judge. He's considered to be one of the most prominent Republicans in the state, and Bert Lance, one of many people, yourself included, who's been surprised by that. Let us have a quick assessment of where this fits into the overall Senate package by going to Washington now and talking to Sandy Van Ocker, who overwatches the Senate for us. Sandy, what does that mean so far?
Peter, that means that the Democrats have lost a seat. And what it also means is that D. Huddleston was a part of the Democratic power structure. He was the ranking member on agriculture. And there's a good case of a state perhaps looking a gift horse in the mouth and saying, that's not enough for us. Because, for example, Jesse Helms is the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, and he's been arguing with the voters of North Carolina. They ought to send him back there so he can protect their interests. We don't know yet whether that's working. I think in the case of D. Huddleston, what really hurt him, though it wasn't really true, some ads that were put out by his opponent. They were done by a man named Roger Ailes in New York, and it featured a hunter following 3 hound dogs through Holiday Inns and motels and on beaches looking for D. Huddleston. The implication was that he was absent a lot. It apparently stuck, even though, as I say, the charge wasn't quite true. But there's a big power gap here, because in addition to agriculture, he was also second to Pat Moynihan on the Democratic side on the Intelligence Committee. So it's a loss not only numerically, it's a loss in the power structure.
Thank you, Sandy, very much. Just to reaffirm what Mitch McConnell did, he kept hitting away at Walter Huddleston being the do-nothing senator, and Sandy suggesting that's one of the things that works. Let's take a look at the popular vote now. As we've said before, not a great, enormous portion of the country by any means reporting in, but with 2% of the popular vote, Mr. Reagan has 63% of it, and Mr. Mondale has 37% of it. Since the last time we looked at it a few minutes ago, Mr. Mondale has crept up just a little in the popular vote. And there are the electoral votes, 133 for Mr. Reagan, none for Mr. Mondale, and 270 needed to win. We'll be back in a moment with what we call our What Do You Think About This department, George Will, Tom Wicker, and Barbara Walters.